Hey, new prospect. This is Joel checking in for RTB today. This is my first time sitting in the seat today as we go through RTB for July the 5th. The 5th after Independence Day, Monday, July the 5th. So I hope you're as excited as I am to go through these. I'm actually wearing my Sunday clothes today because it's Sunday. The original thought that Drew and I had was maybe film this while I was at the beach last week, and like maybe I could film it on the ocean and have this real inspirational video. But it rained the whole time I was at the beach, and we only got to go a couple of times. So anyway, here I am on Sunday recording for Monday, but that's all good. So here we go, July the 5th, Monday, and really what I want to do is obviously just give you some thoughts and perspectives that I had as I read through today's stuff and just share with you just some food for thought. As I am no Old Testament scholar like Dr. Cribb, I am no great theologian like Jay, and I'm not a pastor of the word like Drew. But I'll share some thoughts with you guys, and feel free to comment or hit me up sometime and talk about it, because some of these things are, the passages today are actually kind of at home with me in my life. So let's talk about them. So we're going to get started with Joshua. So look at this. I've been carrying this the whole time. Look at that. Had an RTB, been awesome. So we're going to cover Joshua 7, Psalm 137 and 38, which are pretty interesting Psalms. Jeremiah 1, so we're starting a fresh book, the second major prophet book that we've covered. We covered Isaiah. We finished Isaiah yesterday, and now we're going to start Jeremiah with the call of Jeremiah, and then Matthew 15 as we go back around the New Testament. We'll spend a little bit of time in Matthew, not a whole lot of time as Dr. Cribb has already covered that. So let's start with Joshua. And Joshua 7 is a really sharp turn, a contrast from what has happened in Joshua 5 and 6, where they defeated Jericho with relative ease. In fact, they defeated Jericho with God doing everything. They followed the commandment of God. They marched around the city according to God's command. And when they shouted according to Joshua's command at the end of the marching, the city fell, and everything that was in it was destroyed, or at least it was supposed to be destroyed. But we see here that there's this man named Achan who steps in and kind of messes stuff up for Israel. So at the end, really at the beginning of 7, you see this guy Achan, who's from the tribe of Judah, that takes some things that he wasn't supposed to take. So everything except pretty much the precious metals were supposed to be destroyed. Everything was supposed to be destroyed. It was given up to destruction, but Achan took a little side bit for himself, and it cost Israel greatly. So let's talk about that. And this is funny because it's one of the stories we use a lot in Peru, is the story of Achan and what happened with Achan, because it shows a lot of things that I think are relatable to people. One, it shows that from a sin standpoint, Achan's sin was covering in a way the entire people of Israel. So the covenant community of Israel was responsible for sin in its midst. So because of Achan's sin, the whole covenant community of Israel was tarnished. And this is something we even see in a bigger way in Adam. A lot of people are mad about Adam sinning, but the reality is that when one player on a team commits a foul, the whole team gets penalized. And just like Adam committed the sin on our behalf, that first sin, the original sin, Achan is committing a sin, and his sin is covering the covenant community of Israel on their behalf. So he did not follow God's instruction. So he took some things he wasn't supposed to take, and we'll find out later it's actually a lot of stuff. But then what's interesting is Joshua is just like, I don't know you don't really get the vibe here. What is he just overconfident because Jericho fell so easy? Like, man, Jericho's this great city, this giant city, and the walls just came tumbling down. So he just gets ready to take the next place, and it's AI. There's no consultation with the Lord. There's no plan from the Lord how to take AI. A small city, especially compared to Jericho, a tiny city. So he sends out spies. The spies come back, and they say, you're only going to need like 30, what does he say? You need 3,000 men. So about 3,000 of the men went up there. But when they go up there, they're defeated, and 36 of the men actually die. And Joshua is distraught and tears his clothes. He's just doesn't know what to do. And he consults the Lord, but his consultation is a little bit misplaced because he's concerned about the name of Israel and he's concerned about the name of the Lord, when really he should be concerned about sin in his own camp. And he's not very perceptive when this happens. So the Lord just doesn't even answer him with his questions. He just says, get up. What are you doing? Why are you on your face? Israel, and notice what God says here. He doesn't say Achan has sinned. He has transgressed my covenant that I commanded him. He says Israel has sinned. They have transgressed my covenant I commanded them, and they took some of the devoted things. They have stolen and lied and put them among their own belongings. Therefore, the people of Israel cannot stand before their enemies. So one of the things we see here is that it's not going to be because of Israel. It's not going to be because of Israel's might that they're going to conquer this land. It is only because of God's favor upon them. And it is, they must obey God's commandment when he asked them what he asked them to do, and the purity that he asked them to live by. They must obey, or they will not be successful. So what you see in Jericho is they do obey, they are successful. But what you see at Ai and what you see after when Achan takes the things devoted for destruction is that they are not successful. So it's almost a mirror opposite. It's like the exact opposite of Jericho. They didn't consult the Lord, where in Jericho they did consult the Lord. They weren't pure, where in Jericho they were pure, and they're defeated. So now they cannot stand. It doesn't matter how big the city is. It's only by the Lord's might that they're going to be able to do what they can do. And really, what's interesting is once they've crossed over the Jordan, this is the first time you see what I think a lot of people call Canaanization of the Israelites. The first step, Achan's sin, is like the first step where they start to act like the nations around them. And we know that by the time we get to the Judges, the book of Judges, after Joshua, in many instances, they're just like the Canaanites. And everyone does what's right according to their own eyes, not by what God says is right in his law. So, they go through these lots, if you will, and they find out that it's Achan. Achan confesses. This is interesting. Achan confesses to his sin, but he is still held in judgment for his sin. So Achan confesses. They go dig it up. Turns out it's like a lifetime wage for a person. So it was a great treasure. If you can imagine finding all the money you could ever make in a lifetime for an average person that you just found in one day, he had. And then they were commanded to kill him. And so they brought all his family out there. Doesn't really tell us whether his family was killed as well, but all his possessions, and they stoned him, and everyone stoned him because it was all of Israel that was held to account for his sin. So that pile of stones there is the memorial to Achan and his sin. And I think what you're going to see next is how once they take care of the sin problem, they can then have victory as they move into the promised land and what God has promised them. So it's something to think about. The sin of Achan affecting the entire assembly of Israel, thousands and thousands of people for the sin of one man. Okay, let's move on to Psalms. So we're at Psalms 138. 137 and 138. So 137 is interesting to me because we've been going through a lot of songs here, songs of ascent, songs of thanksgiving from, I don't know, like 28 to 138. It seems like most of them were psalms of thanksgiving, recalling the deeds of the Lord, for his love endures forever. Give thanks to the Lord are some of the things you see. But then when we get to Psalm 137, it's like it just changes. It's totally different. And then we get back to a little more of that in Psalm 138. But Psalm 137 was interesting to me because as like a worship leader, I could really relate to this psalm. So it's recalling the captivity in Babylon, where people who would sing songs to the Lord, I'm guessing Levites or people who would play instruments or were responsible for the worship in the house of the Lord, would be sitting beside, they're in captivity. They're under the willows, presumably, that grow by the Euphrates River there in Babylon. And the captors are asking them to sing songs of Zion. So, hey, sing worship songs, but not because they want to worship the Lord. It's just because they want to be entertained or because they want to gloat over the people of Israel. One of the two. And then what the writer says is, how can I sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill. So Dr. Cribb has talked about how Jerusalem and Zion, this temple itself that had been destroyed, was so deeply connected to the presence of God and so deeply connected to God being with his people. But it's destroyed. It's like totally annihilated and his people are gone. So it seems like all hope is lost. What this writer is saying, like, if I forget Jerusalem, God's presence with his people, let my right hand forget its skill. So his mind is on the right things in this. Let my tongue stick to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you. It's very interesting. So that's a very interesting song for a worship leader, if I think about that. And then we come back around to the end. It kind of changes where there's like this, for what you did to us, I hope that the Lord does to you kind of deal, where we see that where the author is kind of pronouncing doom upon the Edomites, which I think sometimes just kind of represents all of Israel's enemies, but at the same time, they were pretty happy when Babylon took over Jerusalem. In fact, I mean, I think around that time, Edom had expanded into Jerusalem, where like Hebron and a lot of cities that typically were in Judea were now under Edomite control. And then it talks about Babylon, and it's got a rough line there at the end. Blessed shall be he who takes your little ones, talking about against Babylon, and dashes them against the rock, which is a terrible imagery, but is one of the exact things that Babylon did to the people in Jerusalem, the helpless and the young infants. So it's terrible, but a very interesting psalm. And then Psalm 138, this kind of starts the last series of psalms that are attributed to King David. But one of the things I wanted to point out to this is a psalm of thanksgiving. It's called Give Thanks to the Lord. One of the things that stood out to me was verse 4. All the kings of the earth shall give you thanks, O Lord, for they have heard the words of your mouth. it's almost prophetic in nature, because it talks about the kings of the earth. And so Gentiles, these are not people of the Lord. These are not covenant community people in the traditional sense of Israel. These are kings of all the earth, and they're giving thanks to the Lord, for they have heard the words of your mouth. They have heard the word of the Lord. They have heard the gospel message of the Lord, and they're giving thanks to him. Other nations, us, Gentiles across the world, giving thanks to God for his word. So that one really stood out to me. And so, yeah, a great one. And then this kind of goes back to what we talked about today in Psalm 23 and some songs that I love. In the presence of my enemies, though I walk in the midst of trouble, you preserve my life. You stretch out your hand against the wrath of my enemies, and your right hand delivers me. The Lord will fulfill his purpose for me. Your steadfast love, O Lord, endures forever. Do not forsake the work of your hands. Man, what a great song. What a great way to end. And then that's going to take us to Jeremiah. So let's talk a little bit about what we have here in Jeremiah. So this is just the introduction, the call of Jeremiah. And Jeremiah lived during a crazy time. So this is like the beginning of the captivity. And in fact, it was right before, and he lived throughout the beginning of the captivity of Jerusalem. And so Jeremiah is a guy growing up right outside Jerusalem, a young dude. This is during the reign of Josiah. Josiah was a good king. In fact, he led a revival, a cleansing of the temple. He was a boy when he started as a king, and was the last king, good king of Judah. And in fact, he was spared the judgment of Babylon because he was good. But it was coming, right? So you see the call, and this is a very interesting call, because I think this can be said of a lot of people, and certainly this shows the sovereignty of God over his creation. Listen to what God says to Jeremiah in verse 5. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. So God knew exactly what he was going to do with Jeremiah before Jeremiah was even existing in the physical form. So I think that can be said of us, and just a word of encouragement to our pastors, that where you are right now, Jay and Dr. Cribb and Drew, God has totally and sufficiently appointed you for that purpose. And I think that's pretty encouraging for you people who are the shepherds of the flock at New Prospect, that you should be encouraged with, that God knew where you were going to be, and he has equipped you to do the work that he's put you there to do. So that's pretty awesome. Then you have this little, it's not as much excuses as just the truth, but Jeremiah has a little bit of Moses in him. He says, but I'm young and I do not know how to speak, for I'm only a youth. But then God comforts him and says, do not say I'm only a youth, for to all whom I send you, you shall go, and wherever I command you, you shall speak. Do not be afraid for them, for I am with you to deliver you, declares the Lord. And then the Lord puts his hand on his mouth, almost similar to Isaiah when he calls Isaiah instead of the coals. He's actually just setting Jeremiah apart by putting his hand on his mouth. He's giving him his words. The words that Jeremiah says are going to be the words of the Lord. Behold, I have put my words in your mouth, he says. See, I have set you this day over nations, over kingdoms, to pluck up and break down. So he's going to be preaching against sin, to destroy and overthrow. He's going to be preaching judgment. But this is interesting, to build and to plant. So he's preaching also hope, renewal for the people, the covenant people of Israel, and for all the nations, because Jeremiah is called to preach to all the nations. Again, it's not just Jeremiah preaching to the people of Israel. In fact, the last king of Israel couldn't really stand Jeremiah, but he's also preaching to the people of the world. And you'll see that later on when Jeremiah gets sent to Egypt. He's going to be preaching to them as well. Then he asked them a couple things, and this is just really cool. The Lord is kind of asking him, hey, Jeremiah, what do you see? And Jeremiah sees this almond branch. And then God says, you're right. You have seen well, for I am watching over my word to perform it. So an almond branch is like the first thing that pops out in the spring. And you're watching for spring. Once you see that almond branch pop out, spring is coming. And God here is saying, I am watching over the time to when my word will take place. So his word is going to happen. So the things that he is going to preach through Jeremiah will happen. And we'll see that later in the exile. And we'll also see that later in Jeremiah's book. So that pretty much wraps up everything here. I'm going to just briefly talk about Matthew. In Matthew, we're reading in Matthew 15. But one of the things that stands out in Matthew 15 is that a couple of things. Jesus, again, is confronted by the Pharisees, and in which he confronts them over some of their teachings that they hold as law from God, which really they're just traditions. And he affirms this by saying it's the things that come out of your mouth. It's not things you eat that make you unclean. It's what you say, because what you say is a reflection of the heart. And then he actually goes up to Lebanon, Tyre and Sidon, which is kind of Lebanon area, which is not, at that time, it's not a Jewish area. And a Gentile woman comes to him, and kind of is interesting that her faith uses imagery that typically Jews would associate with Gentiles. They would call them dogs. They're dogs to them. They're not covenant. They're not clean. But she uses this to show her faith that even the dogs want scraps from the master's table. And her faith makes heals her daughter. And then last we see Jesus feed the 4,000. And just after he fed the 5,000. And it's funny enough, the disciples right after, like a couple verses prior, like, hey, how are you going to feed these 4,000? It's like, dude, he just fed 5,000. He can feed 4,000 as well. So these are just some things to ponder today on this day, July 5th, on a Monday. I hope you guys have a great week. I love you guys, and I look forward to seeing you again. See ya. Grace and peace.